Trail and ultra runners, what is going on? What's happening? Welcome to the first episode of the Koopcast for 2022. I hope your year has started off with a bang. I hope that you're starting to get all of your races and events and goals lined up for the year. Mine certainly has. It's been an incredibly busy season over the course of the past 6 weeks. I'm really excited about the next several guests that we have lined up on the Koopcast. The first of which is going to touch on a topic that I've touched on a lot in trail and ultramarathon running, and that is this subject of injuries, how to prevent them, and the overall injury rates. Make no mistake that I think that we are doing a pretty bad job across the entirety of the community of preventing and treating injuries, particularly repetitive stress injuries, and we can't do enough to try to unravel the mystery of why these things start to occur. And so on the podcast today, I brought on the lead author of a narrative review that I happened to find in September of last year, the title of which is The Consequences of Training and Competition to the Musculoskeletal System in Ultramarathon Runners. And this was in Frontiers in Physiology in September of 2021. I have the lead author of that paper, Alicja Partyka, and I have her advisor, Zibby, on as well to discuss what this whole compilation of literature that we could find in ultramarathon runners, what it actually says about how we can prevent them, what the root causes of this are in the first place, and practically what can athletes do from a training perspective, from a cross-training perspective, from a strength training perspective, to try to stay on the right side of the injury line. I would encourage all the athletes that are listening to this podcast to go back and also listen to this series of 3 podcasts that I did with my 3 favorite physical therapists that I work with, which are John Chow, Jessica Lehman, and Nat Collins, that I did several weeks ago. That is a treasure trove of information on how they view their physical therapy practice and getting athletes on the right side of the line. But one of the themes that will certainly emerge throughout the course of this particular podcast is that simple solutions are always the best ones. That's true in training, and that is certainly true when we start to look at the body of literature that exists that relates to injury rates and injury prevention in trail and ultramarathon runners. So keep that in mind as a theme throughout the course of this podcast. There's the initial ramble. I'm going to get right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Alicja Partyka and Zibby, all about injuries in ultramarathon running. Well, I have to tell you, Alicja, like you're trying to tackle a pretty big bull, right? And what I mean by that is all runners are injured, and it's a problem. It's a problem that's plagued the endurance community ever since the endurance community was a community. And I've said on this podcast a number of times that we quite frankly, we suck at it. We suck at being uninjured. If you look, no matter how you slice and dice it, and you know the data way more than I do, the injury prevalence rate, in my mind, when I look at it analytically, I'm like, this is unacceptable as a community. Like for anywhere between 50 and 70% of people getting injured in a year for a particular sport, that's just not. I don't view that as an acceptable outcome. Now, I don't profess to know what the answers are, right? And that's why we lean on good folks like you and the physical therapy community and things like that. But I appreciate you trying to tackle it because it is such a big one, and it makes a big difference for athletes in terms of their overall outcomes, because training availability is such a big part of success at the end of the day in endurance sports. So to start out with, I appreciate you tackling it. I realize it's not an easy answer, and it's not one that we're going to come up with some sort of like lightning bolt at the end of this podcast and say, oh, well, if everybody just took the blue pill, instead of the red pill, then everybody would be fine. It's definitely not going to be like that. But before we get into this, I want to get a little bit of background just on your research group and your team and the university. And I think, Zibby, you might be the you might be the person to answer this. Can you kind of just give the audience just like a general overview of the university there and the sports that you're working with and some of the research that's getting conducted there?
So first of all, Jason, thanks that you invited us here, and it will be a pleasure. It's very nice that somebody noticed our paper, which is not so common in everyday life. So thank you very much for inviting us. And I am from the university, or let's say university is a big word because it's a small university, small school, academic one, but it's focused on physical education and sport and physiotherapy also. And my interest in the ultramarathon or also marathon was, as always it happens, but was accidental. I was running a lot, but then I started to run a marathon. Then my friend professor started making a perfect research. And then when I took part for the first time in the research, looking at these people running 24 hours, well, it was the day when everything started. And I don't have a great team, big team in university. We have a 4 or 5 person researching the ultramarathon from the physiological point of view. And I'm just also researching the motivation of the ultramarathon and marathon. So that is, let's say, the background. And we have a nice laboratory, nice research center, which helps. And what is more important, the most important thing, I have like 10, 12 marathon runners, which are always keen to make a research. So when I'm inviting them just to make 24-hour run in winter, in summer, anytime, just call me and I am ready, let's say in a couple of days, and they're coming and what doing, punishing them and running. So that is nice. And thanks to them, they would not heard about it because they are, let's say, they don't speak English, because in Poland, the group of ultramarathoners are mostly not educated and just like, normal everyday people. So I think let's start with this maybe, yeah.
It's so hilarious that you mentioned that, because everybody that I've brought on in this podcast, and most people have this kind of like cross bridge between studying some of the more traditional endurance sports like cycling and marathon running, and then they kind of cross into ultra. And one of the points that they always lament is like, we can't find subjects that will want to run on a treadmill for 24 hours or 12 hours or whatever the protocol is because the subject pool of people that can actually do that starts to dwindle down pretty quickly. But B, even the subject pool of people that can do it, the ones that want to do it, even get whittled down even more. But it's good that you've got an enthusiastic group there that you can constantly poke and prod.
Yeah, just adding a little, they have also some relations with us because we help them also in training. I mean, they give them results. We help them, the measuring all the stuff, just helping them with the diet. So it's a kind of both way relationships and mutual interest, let's say. But it's not so easy. Just 3 times per year coming to laboratory, making some, so hard stuff. It's absolutely not easy, and but thanks to them, it's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna dive into a narrative review. A narrative review paper, Alicia, that you wrote on injuries in ultramarathon running. And as I mentioned during the onset, this is something that it currently plagues the endurance community, and I think it's going to continue to plague the endurance community. And so to tackle it from this big, broad narrative review perspective, I think is quite a monumental task, because the scope of what you're looking at is so broad, but also B, within an ultramarathon context, the data, and I'm going to let you speak to this in a second, it's kind of thin, just because it's and what I mean by that is there haven't been a lot of really controlled studies or even observational studies on ultramarathoners as a whole that we, in a very robust fashion, that we can look at and draw some conclusions. And so you're trying to do that. So I appreciate the effort, despite some of those limitations. So to start out with, like, what first off, what prompted you to do this? Like, because you probably knew the situation going in, that you were going to be faced with some of these variables. Like, what motivated you to start to tackle this narrative review in the first place?
I cannot deny it was a tough task to do, but my motivation was just a curiosity. Because it happened to me that I'm a runner, and it happened to me to be a part of the organization group of the Ultrarunning race. I was volunteering there, and it was by chance, but I was quite surprised that such people can do that, and they are still alive, and they are just still doing that for several years without any injuries which would stop them from doing that. So as I'm a medicine student, I started reading some stuff, looking for some resources, and in fact, I was surprised how many I found. And by time I just read too many of them, and because of that, I decided not to just keep it for me. I decided to write a paper just to share it with the others.
So it was an innate curiosity based off of you observing this silly sport where people can somewhat appear to continue to locomote and perform even after hours and hours and hours on end. I think you just touched on one of the things that I initially want to talk about is that one of the things that comes through in the paper that we're starting to see this theme emerge more and more across a lot of different areas of ultramarathon running, not just injury, which is going to be the predominant topic that we're going to discuss today. But this is this concept that ultramarathons are not simply long marathons. And we see that theme pop up from a training perspective. We see ultramarathon runners train a whole lot differently than marathon runners. We see them look a lot different than other marathon runners just from a visual standpoint. Their nutrition is different, certainly from marathon runners. Their psychology is different from marathon runners. And Zibby, you have done a lot of research in this area based on motivation. We can definitely see a compare and contrast between the ultramarathon world and the marathon world. But specific to this paper, one of the things that kind of came through is the injuries themselves are different between the marathon community and the ultramarathon community. And I wanted to know, can you help us kind of understand what that fundamental difference is and maybe why we see those differences in injuries between those two groups, which you think would be similar because it's all just running, right?
Yeah, that's true. It's all just running, but like we have to distinguish all those differences which we can see. It's not only about the distance, but also the pace, the terrain, the climate. Most of ultra runners run in the mountains, so that's all the reasons which can lead us to that thing that it's not only longer marathon.
And I think one of the take-home points from that is the way to potentially mitigate some of those injuries might not look the same as the way to potentially mitigate them in a running perspective. So this is kind of where I'm going to ask us to take our research hats off and put our practical like coaching and training hats on, and maybe Zibby, you can jump in from this perspective as well, because there has been a relatively well-established way to help prevent injuries from a traditional running perspective. And that runs all the way from load management, right? And the very prototypical 10% rule of volume increase is predominantly rooted in this injury prevention perspective. There's a lot of physical therapy modalities and strength training modalities and things like that that are kind of aimed at specifically keeping marathon runners healthy. And I'm wondering if either of you can comment on is how much we should be translating those into the ultramarathon world with that same outcome, knowing that the injuries are they're at least different, whether they're slightly or to a large degree different, that's to the eye of the beholder. But should we at least be looking at it differently? And then maybe even how can we look at those mitigation strategies differently?
So maybe let me say something. First of all, we have to separate runners. I mean, like because the reasons of the injuries when we have are different. When we have let's say beginner, I call them sometimes non-starters, which they practice a lot, they're preparing for some, let's say, marathon first time in a year in their life, and then they probably are not prepared to the first marathon. I think it's normal. They are not prepared because they cannot expect what they happen to them even. And the most of the injuries in the marathon runners, in the beginners, are because they are unprepared for the marathon. So that is the reason. And the second reason is if we look at the, let's say, elite amateur or the professional runners, and then we touch the different area of the injuries, because these runners, these athletes are prepared for running because they know what to expect. They run, I don't know, several times this distance or the area, and sometimes the injuries appear by accident. I mean, the surface, something just happened, the misconduct of anything. And then another one, which are unexpected because the workload was so high that our body cannot, survive this workload, which happens especially with elite amateurs, with professionals, which try to win the race. And then they push the body above the limit, not above the limit because they were unprepared to the limit, but it will be, higher and higher and higher. As you know, I tried to calculate it to miles because normally we use kilometers. The world record in 24-hour run is approximately 188 miles, which is huge distance, 24 hours run. So the pace in miles is 764 minutes per mile, whole 24 hours. So you can imagine how great workload is put on the athlete. Okay, we can lower it to some decent result. I don't know which result in 24 hours you expect. Like, let's say everything, in my opinion, everything above 130 miles per 24 hours is decent result for me. What do you think?
Yeah, you kind of broke up there. I didn't catch the last part of that question.
Okay, I mean that if the decent result in 24-hour run is above 130 miles.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's say that. And if I could, in a calculator, it's 9 minutes per hour, even 9 minutes per mile. So it's also very, very hard workload. And then we can look at the guys who is running at this speed, at this level, prepared, unprepared, and so on and so on. So these reasons are, first of all, separated with unprepared people and elite athletes, two different worlds. So it's the first reason. And what about this unprepared? Well, it's it's lottery. You can took any injury, but it's not the reason about the ultramarathon because the people are unprepared. And in elite athletes, then we can calculate and point specific injuries which are reasoned by some preparation.
Okay, so with the normal people, right, the non-elite athletes, based on what you are seeing in the research, is it really just a matter of preparation? I mean, this is what you're kind of coming down to. Is it really just they're screwing their training up, essentially, is the way I would look at it as a coach?
Yeah, just shortly, mostly there's unprepared, as sometimes I have the examples with my friends, they are overtrained even.
Sure.
They are ultramarathon runners, but are very often overtrained. And then when it's coming to the race, and then it's absolutely not working, and mostly it finished with the serious injuries even.
But let me ask you this, because Alicia, you might want to jump in with this piece since you dived so much into the literature. That conclusion, can we kind of base that off of a process of elimination, or is it more, are we coming more to that conclusion based on what is out there? And what I mean by that is you can look at, okay, this isn't causing injury, that's not causing injury, we can't supplement, all that well to help prevent injury, and eventually it just comes down to, well, the only thing that's left is training, right? That's the only variable left that's like correlated with it. Or is there something that's actually definitively pointing to people are just not training very well? I hate to say that as a coach, like we're not doing our jobs or whatever. I guess what I'm trying to get to is it a process of elimination, or is there definitive research that's pointing to that answer, that it's the training component that's driving most of these injuries?
Well, I think that is all about the training. In fact, all other factors can also influence that, but the biggest influence is just about the training. And also I wanted to add that the thing which is also important that are those injuries which are already ongoing and they are not completely healed before the race. So just sometimes it's about the common sense and the decision to make if it's really worth it to try to compete with that in that condition, right? You know what I mean?
Well, the prevalency rate on that, every time I go and I reread the literature on this, I'm always shocked when I see that, to know that anywhere between like 10 and 60% of the people lining up for an ultra marathon have an injury when they're going into it. I just, once again, going back to my very original statement, I just kind of shake my head and go, we are just doing this all wrong. It should not be this way. And I wanted to know from you, is that shocking to either one of you, like knowing the marathoning world, knowing the endurance world, knowing the ultra marathon world, that so many people are lining up on the start line already battling some type of injury?
Yeah, it's still surprising a lot, but for sure there is some motivation to do that. We cannot deny. And like, I think that still ultramarathoners just they want to prevent it, but still the time they put into training and the efforts, it's too much just to say that they don't want to compete for some period of time and just to give them rest.
Well, I think a lot of it ties in, Zibby, with some of your previous work that we weren't planning on talking about, but we might as well jump into it. And this is just the motivation amongst this group of athletes, which is different than marathon runners, but also I would say higher than marathon runners. And then I'll also say that the amount of time, or the frequency at which ultramarathoners compete at is higher than your prototypical marathoner. Then there's a lot of good statistics that I'll link in the show notes from Run Repeat site that'll point to that. But I'm wondering if you could kind of jump in based on your previous experience with motivation amongst ultramarathoners, is that playing into this whole injury cycle that we're seeing in the ultramarathon community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also the good comparison is that, you know, a lot of people trying to climb the Mount Everest. Most of them are unprepared for this, and I think sometimes it's very, you know, fancy to start in ultra marathon. Marathon, what is it? Marathon now? It's nothing. Well, everybody run marathon. Let's try on a water or whatever. Yeah, that's you know, something. Yeah. So I think that people, you know, trying to get on the, you know, high emotions with this and unprepared, trying to, you know, to evidence somebody to people. And in our paper there was a data that about the age and injury in ultramarathon, and it was evidence showed that the older ultramarathon runners had less injuries than younger ones. And of course it's related to some factors. First of all, they created a higher tolerance to pain, and their body is prepared, you know, most times they were prepared to extreme conditions than younger ones. There is also data, I don't know how to treat them, but they calculated that a 10 years age difference is related to decrease by half injury. So if you part the ultra marathoners, you know, by 10 years brackets, you know, every 10 years training ultra marathon properly with the coach and according to all the rules, decrease the possibility of injury. So that is also the reason. And about this motivation now, that is you probably know it's an interesting story because these motivations are completely different. We are using I was using the let's say old device or all the questionnaire, which is motivation on marathon scale. Obviously, Masterson is like, I don't know, 40 years ago did it like 76 question, which is, you know, boring to put the marks and everything. But I had a group, very big, more than 1,500 people. did it, and there was like two important words. First was one just showing what is this motivation, and there is these motivations are divided into four areas. Let's say psychological, it's like life meaning and self-esteem. Second one is achievement, let's say, such as sport, it's a personal goal of achievement and competition, social and physical. So there's like four areas, you know. And interesting was that I divided the guys like marathon runners and ultra marathon runners. To become an ultra marathoner in my experiment, it has to be like finish 3 ultra marathon runs. And okay, well, it was like maybe simple division, but I had to choose some. And it was like the short distance runners, you know, rated psychological coping, self-esteem, competition, and health and weight concept as larger motivation than ultra runner colleagues. Yeah, and what is interesting, the ultra runners were driven more by qualitative aspects of the running. I mean, the life meaning and affiliation. So, you know, mostly for this, I know a lot of them, and for them, you know, the traveling, racing with friends, being in this society is absolutely more important than good results and winning the competition. It doesn't mean that they didn't strive to win, but you know, it's not so important. So according to the age, it changes also. So it was my second paper what I did, and it showed that absolutely now it sounds absolutely funny, you know, that for ultra marathoners, health orientation at older ages is very important, which sounds, you know, maybe also as a reason why the older ultra marathon runners has less injuries, because they take care about
it. This all kind of comes back, and the one thing I could keep thinking about is that an overabundance of enthusiasm is the root cause of all of this, right?
Probably, yes. Yeah, probably.
I mean, and you go back, even this age proposition, which, you know, I mean, I think if you presented that to somebody who is unfamiliar with the research, and maybe they're like a freshman level exercise physiology student, and you said, hey, is it more likely that the younger athletes are getting injured or the older athletes are getting injured in an ultramarathon? They'd probably say the older athletes, because they're older, they're more frail, they have more miles on their legs and all this other stuff. And it's actually the opposite, right?
Absolutely.
The older, more experienced athletes actually have fewer injuries. And I think it's predominantly driven by the younger runners they have an overabundance of enthusiasm, and they can handle acute workloads much more readily, and they don't know any better. They can handle acute workloads much more readily than the older athletes, but because of that, 4 weeks down the line, then they get hurt after all those, you know, acute workloads start to add up. Is there anything else remarkable that is worth mentioning on this phenomenon of more experienced athletes get injured less? And once again, you might have to kind of take your research hat off and extrapolate a little bit, but I think that this area is actually quite fascinating, and there's going to be opinions left, right, and center, whether it's an experience thing or whether just the sheer volume of miles that they have makes them more tolerant, or, you know, the younger athletes are just stupid and not training correctly, you know, or they have an overabundance of enthusiasm, as I mentioned earlier. But I was wondering what you guys think about that. Like, is there anything that you observe or that we can kind of like tease out of the research that is just interesting about this experience part, where more experienced athletes, older athletes, actually get injured less than less experienced athletes?
Maybe Alicia, if you want to say, because you're just thinking.
I'm not sure, but I think, like, in my opinion, it's also about that years of training leads them to the reconstruction of their body, right? And that can help them to achieve more and to get injured less frequently. And it comes on not only to muscles, but also to the rest of the body, right?
Yeah, and I think maybe you can also talk about some of the time course of those adaptations. And this ties back to the interventions piece that I was talking about earlier, where a lot of athletes, they'll want to undertake a physical therapy program or a strength training program or something to like shore up or strengthen their tendons and ligaments and things like that. And if what we're seeing in the research is that the more experienced athletes are getting injured less. Does that speak in parallel with some of the time courses of those particular adaptations, specifically to the tendons and ligaments that we're actually talking about, or is it just something where we can't really draw conclusions from?
I'm not sure. I think that about the any physiotherapy treatments, I think that the younger ones are more efficient because they know them, they use them. It's a more popular. In my experience, the older ultramarathon runners, the only one is I don't know, hot water after hot bath after the run, something like this. Even some of them, when I was arranging, I was the organizing like 4 times Polish championships, 24-hour run and 48 run. And we just prepared the massages for them, the massagers, and let's say 10% of them use them. The rest of them say, okay, we're finished, let's go home, it's done. And then going to car, traveling like 600 kilometers to home, using no therapy. And that first hours after race are the most important one. So it's, I think the older ones doesn't care about the physiotherapy. I think it's my opinion, not my opinion, my just, experience, which I saw with the athletes. We had one time we had a research like 48-hour run. And then we keep them for 3 days in a hotel just to make blood samples. And trust me, most of them didn't leave the room even for nothing, just waiting in the room to come to them. We said, hey, there is a swimming pool, there is some, some area if you want. No, it's okay, I'm fine, okay. I don't need anything. I have a free time here, so it's good, perfect. You bring me food, everything. That's nice, yeah. So it's I think sometimes I think that ultra marathon people are out of any rules. It's absolutely for me. And let's say we have to extract from this the professional ones. Which usually strive for the world records, for winning the competition, like Kouros or Kylian Jornet. It's a totally other part of the world for me. I did the research on them, and trust me, we have some cases. One case was like a guy during the 24-hour run. It was like 14 hours already. And he just had some problem with breathing, with the heart. The emergency took him from the race to the hospital, checked him all these CK levels. I mean the cardiac on all, which I show, and they did it 3 times. They checking the machine if it works. Because his level of the CK was like 100 times norm. Yeah. So probably they said you cannot leave. It's impossible. According to normal people, you are dead. Okay, it was a Belarusian guy, and he said, well, okay, if I'm dead, I can go back to the race, and he just got out from the hospital, trust me, and 6 hours more just was walking to the end of the race. So, these people sometimes get out of any scientific rules and anything, which is also related to their motivation and tolerance to pain, which they created during the years.
Well, and that's why I always caution people when they look at whatever successful elite athlete and they say, well, so-and-so does this in order to perform well or to become uninjured, which is the theme of this conversation. So that's what I'm going to do. A lot of ways they just hit the genetic lottery. Alicia, and you touched on this in the paper, right? I mean, genetics might have a role to play in all this. That's a hard I have a genetics degree, right? That's a really complicated area to tease out. But for certain, we see athletes that, despite themselves, continue to remain uninjured, and there's no explanation for it, right? They violate every single rule that you could see in training, and everybody's, we're having a failure of audio here. Everybody's throwing up their hands on this Zoom call. But I think.
But listen, if I may interrupt you, these guys, it wouldn't last for the whole year, whole life. There is some point where the body has just say, oh no, stop, I wouldn't do it anymore. I have one paper about my case study about the ultramarathon runner, extreme guy who was running from Poland to Vatican to Spain, 42 marathons, 42 days, all the crazy stuff. And we suppose that he's, I don't know, from steel or for what, yeah? But being 51, he has a chest pain, landing in the cardiology division in the hospital and so on. And after 2 weeks of this, the doctor said, most of your heart, enzymes, cardiac functions are very bad, but please don't stop running. if you stop running, you will die for sure. So it was absolutely. It was luckily he got to the professor cardiologist who was very educated in sport cardiology also, because normal professor put him to the bed lying for 1 year just getting recovery, and he just said, oh, after 2 days he wanted to come to practice, but okay, after 2 weeks he came running still, but of course lower intensities, just taking care more. And probably he would not be injured at the end of the career, because now he's very careful about it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that anecdote there, that there is a limit to it. And typically, sometimes it takes decades for that to actually show up, but there are limits to it. And we got to be careful what we mirror and or parrot in our own practices, and what athletes mirror or parrot in their own practices that are based off of some other athlete that may or may not work for them. I kind of want to steer this a little bit back to more of the injury prevention part of it. So we've kind of come to this conclusion. This has been a conclusion on from a number of different guests on my podcast, that training load management and experience are the predominant things that affect injury rates, meaning more experienced athletes and athletes that are managing their injury load correctly are going to be the big heavy hitters here. Is there anything really specific that we can direct athletes to get a handle on this? Because a lot of people listening to this, they're not coaches, they're everyday athletes. They're looking at their training, they're preparing for the Western States 100 or Hard Rock or some ultra marathon, either here in the US or abroad, and they kind of want to know how to bring those best practices to life from a practical point of view, right? They know how much they're running right now, and they want some direction, some sort of like directional arrow on their training. Are there any broad recommendations that either get teased out through the literature or an extension of the literature, Alicia, that you did, that we can guide these athletes with to try to stay on the kind of the right side of this injury line?
Yeah, in fact, one thing which came to my mind is just to practice also different activities to diversify our training, right? I know that many ultra marathons, they are not only running. That's not the way to be the best. Like, you should add to your training also other different activities, like cycling. Some of them are swimming, some of them are practicing yoga. And that's the thing, because ultra marathon, it needs our whole body to work. Sometimes, even if they are climbing the mountain, they are using poles to do it. And in fact, during the ultra marathon, the runners are using their whole body, I think. And from my experience, it looks like this, that we need something more than running.
So this kind of comes back to some of the differences between marathon runners and ultramarathon runners and the way their injuries show up. So prototypical marathon injury is an overuse injury, right? Emphasis on the word overuse. It's a repetitive stress injury. You're doing the exact same motion within a very, very, very finite degree. The exact same motion, thousands and tens of thousands of times throughout the course of any sort of training cycle. When you get into an ultramarathon perspective, and for this example, I'm using kind of the prototypical ultramarathoner that's a trail ultramarathoner, not a 24-hour track runner or something like that. That repetitive stress is always slightly altered, right? Because the surface is different, the grade is different, their stride length is different, their stride rate is slightly different. All the different biomechanical angles that kind of compound into these overuse injuries all kind of get varied out. And you see this play out in the types of injuries, right, between marathon runners and ultramarathon runners, whether it's a ligament injury or a tendon injury. So Alicia, your comment on the cross-training modalities being kind of part of that whole injury management equation is actually quite suited, because the modality isn't as specific, right? That's the way I would take that as a coach, right? A typical marathon run training program, that mode is very, very specific because all the biomechanics are essentially identical, right? From the beginning to the training to the end of the training. And ultramarathon, since you're going uphill, downhill, off camber, on trail, off trail, all those biomechanics are so different that these cross training modalities might be able to mitigate training, but also have a little bit greater degree of specificity towards the training process as well, because it's not so locked into one biomechanical pattern.
Yeah, exactly. Like also adding some practicing of running downhills and just to get used to things which they are going to use during the race.
Yeah, training specificity. This came out in your paper as well, right? Training specifically for the race. We're all kind of laughing right now. Like, why is that so funny? It seems like such an obvious thing to do, but yet so many people don't do it. Zibby, you jump in right here because you just made a really good smirk. I mean, is this something that we need to take in? We need to put higher on the priority list in terms of overall training and potentially mitigating injury, this training specificity component?
Yeah, surprising is that this is so obvious, as you said, that people don't do this. So that's the reason why. I don't know why they don't do this, but I also think that a really important thing that the people should make some testing during the practicing, before the racing, and after racing. You know, I know it's not so obvious and not so popular, but I think I'm not saying about the injuries to our movement system, our muscles, bones, and cartilages. Okay, that is I leave it behind. But most of the overtraining about the cardiac, problems comes from limited knowledge for people, because I don't know, you work as a coach, probably how many people is taking a laboratory test of VO2 max?
Yeah, very
Probably
few.
very few. Yeah, okay.
Few.
So during this test, you can find your border, which shouldn't you exceed. I mean, like the anaerobic level, which is, you have to know that I would not exceed, like, I don't know, 165 heart rate per minute or whatever, because if I move above this limit, for sure I finish in a bad shape, probably with some problems. Very little people is doing this. And another one is which I suggest to people which will hear us, and make once, I know it's not so easy, but like making 6 or 5 times going to the blood testing with all the most important morphological parameters to test. For instance, the creatine kinase, CK, it's a very popular one. It shows the muscle damage in the humans, and there is often, normally in the trained athlete, after, let's say, 48 hours, it comes to the normal pre-race state level. I mean, like, it's normally it's 300 units. So, athletes sometimes exceed 70 times this level, which is absolutely, it shows the muscles are absolutely damaged. And in trained athletes, after maximum 72 hours, it comes to the pre-race level. So now it's like huge race, and then it comes to the normal level. And very often in untrained people, it took even more than 7 days. Yeah. So if you go for at least slow jog, a slow training after 2 days, then you are still in the area where your muscles are damaged and you're damaging them once more. So, once per year, let's say 5 or 10 years, people should do like how long it takes my body to recover. With this one simple, this creatine kinase. It will be great, avoiding the injuries, because I know many times that, I feel good, my muscles feel good, but the CK, it doesn't pain. So it's just, in our blood, it changes membranes, and the blood flow is very complicated then. I know you have to go to the doctor just to make a prescription to some testing, blood testing, so on, but I think it's good to find out our mechanisms in our body individually. And then that after such a heavy race, I need 2 weeks complete rest, for instance. Yeah. And I think that will be reasons that we help just avoid some basic overtraining injuries, which came also that we are not rested already.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I've had a number of blood testing specialists on my podcast as well, and they've really emphasized 2 big things. The first one, it's both of these speak to exactly what you're talking about, Zibby. The first one is having a purpose with why you're testing, right? So if you want to test for nutritional deficiencies, you want very specific tests for that, and you want a certain frequency for those tests. If you want to test for muscle damage or the recovery from muscle damage, you want very specific tests for that, but also you want to do it at specific times that are different than if you're testing for some sort of mineral or nutrient type of deficiency. And I think all too often people think that, oh, well, I'm just going to get one test and I'm going to glean this treasure trove of information from it. And really just one of them is it's kind of meaningless unless something is very, very far off the spectrum in a disease state.
But you know, the only one more just one more easy way just to test our conditions are, you know, heart rate variation test.
Yeah.
All we have, you know, the watches which even Polar system have implemented to the watch. You wake up in the morning, you're just using it like 2 minutes or 4 minutes, you know, and then you know how your body recovering, how your heart is recovered or not. So I think that 5% of athletes doing this, you know. all of them know this, but I don't know. Do you know any athletes doing such a testing?
No, I mean, I would say very, very few. It's really interesting that you mentioned that, because I kind of come back to this. I have to have interventions that people are going to comply with. And intellectually, this is going to be a complete tangent, by the way. You guys are just going to have to put up with it. Intellectually, when people are putting in 10 to 20 hours a week of training, you would think that they would be able to make the time to once every 2 months, once every 4 weeks, go get a blood test, to spend 2 minutes every morning checking their heart rate variability. But the compliance on those things that are such a small proportion of their overall training time is quite shit, to be honest with you. Their compliance is just terrible. No matter how much I emphasize it or whatever, they'll do the 20 hours a week training, but if they spend, 2 minutes a morning checking their heart rate variability, it's like 50% hit rate. It's hilarious.
Yeah, that is the reasoning totally what you're coming, you know, that the injuries appear, you know. People don't care, you know, they have a training plan, they do they will do this training plan, let's hope properly, and that's done, yeah. They think that they are prepared for marathon or even sometimes from ultra marathon. Well, but it doesn't work like this.
Yeah, well, and it kind of comes back to, this is the golden goose, right? So you guys mentioned from the onset that preparation is kind of the key, right? People are coming into events underprepared. They're going into training, their training environment or the training load that they want to adjust to in an underprepared fashion. In a lot of ways, if you think about it, trail and ultra running it's ripe for that, because you can't make your training sessions as granular as you can on the road, right? If you're doing road running, you can turn around at any point, right? You can run 10K, you can run 10.2K, you can run 10.4K with a lot of precision, right? Or whatever time equivalent. On the trails, that granularity gets kind of lost because of the logistics of it. You get stuck on a loop, or you want to do this route and it's either 10 miles or 20 miles or, 15K or 30K or something like that. Like, the differences in how granular you can make each training run or just less, right? A lot of it depends on the area. But when we come back to this whole mystery, Alicia, that you were trying to unravel, and if it really is training load parts of it, athletes have to have practical ways in order to adjust and design their training load, right? Or I guess I should say that opposite: design and then adjust their training load. And I think the first theme that we touched on earlier, to kind of put a pin on that, is to think of yourself as a more experienced athlete, right? And you're just generally doing less at that point. And the second thing is if you have some very basic monitoring pieces, those will go a long way. And this is something that you didn't touch on in the paper, but I'm going to bring up just because we've been talking about it here. Some very basic heart rate variability monitoring and or blood test monitoring and things like that will go a long way. It doesn't need to be over elaborate, but from an injury prevention standpoint, you can pick up a lot of things. Alicia, is there anything else, as we're starting to wrap up on this, that was remarkable to you that kept coming up in all of the pieces of literature that you were reviewing, which were a lot? I was trying to take a tally a second ago. Hold on a second. It's over 70 citations that are in this one review paper. Was there anything that was remarkable to you that just kept coming up time and time and time again? That's a theme that's worth touching on.
Like right now, it's quite difficult for me to distinguish such a thing, because it was over a year ago when I finished the paper, like all those preparations and citing thing. But let me think for a minute. I think like many authors referred to CK for sure. It was like one of the most popular biomarker.
Creatine kinase is what you're referring to the audience that's not familiar with that abbreviation.
Creatine kinase.
Yeah.
Okay, CK is a creatine kinase.
Yeah, like it's a biomarker of muscle damage, and in fact, it was seen to appear in such many papers that we already know quite much about CK and ultrarunning, and many associations between other markers and CK, and yeah, that's the thing. So in that case, I think that we can take much more from blood tasting than it was before.
Yeah, and that is one where it has such a huge variability associated with it, right? I go back to some of the research. I was trying to pull it up in this book that's on my desk. Some of the research that was done at the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc, where they will find some athletes will finish the race with a CK value of around 3,000 and other ones over 100,000. And when you see that type of biological variability amongst people that have gone through the exact same thing, right? It's all 160 kilometers. It's always quite remarkable, and it makes you think, why is that different? And it comes down to training, right? The ones with more training exhibit less muscular damage, and the ones with less training exhibit more muscular damage. It kind of comes back to the simple proposition that we've come back to time and time again. Zibby, is there anything else you want to touch on within this research, or anything else in your at your university, in your lab, that you guys are doing?
Generally, there was two research in this review paper that showed that absolutely the better runners, leaders, show the lower levels of creatine kinase, even if they have a greater intensity. They had to put the greater workload because they won the race. Or they were leaders of the race. So that is also important. If you are well prepared, if you are not overtrained but well prepared, which is sometimes really, really hard point, because the ultra marathon runners think that if they run more, they will be better at the race, which is not true, because our human body, has some limits to training, and then you get overtrained, and then you just skip out on the race because you are done, let's say. But what I wanted to say, and just to be kind of advice, because we have a paper in 2019 in Journal of Clinical Medicine about the novel cardiac biomarkers about the cardiac, about our heart. And I suggest every marathon runner, especially ultra marathon runner, just to first of all make an echocardiogram of whatever they can do in the area before starting to practice really hard, because many people has many disabilities with the heart response, and probably they can kill it themselves, So that is the reason. And another one, that the cardiac biomarkers have a specific way of working of, I don't want to just get into details, but most of such a people who want to race and make like 160 miles run, they should absolutely make let's say extensive. I cannot remember. The VO2 max and cardiac research during the exercise, how the heart works during the exercise. Tested in the every cardiology division has such a devices, and then you will know if your heart is generally ready for the racing. And we have many examples in Poland that very talented, very young, and very all the ones, let's say, guys stopped training because they overused their heart and didn't treat they never tested their heart. You know, that is the strange reason. In Poland, there is, in my opinion, stupid rule when you're when you want to start in any race, you just sign any, you know, certificate. Okay, I agree, I'm healthy and everything fine with me. I take care about myself. Okay, you sign it, yeah. And then 30% of ultramarathon runners, you know, after 12 hours of 24 hours run, just, you know, stop running because they can't do it longer. In professional sport in Poland, you have to be tested by the medical doctor before you start the race, and then you can imagine it looks totally different. You know, I don't know how it works in States, but probably it's the same case. Yeah, that you say that I'm everything fine with me. I sign anything, and that's all. So that's my suggestion to people who want to treat the ultramarathon running seriously. Just test your heart during intensity, during the exercise, because you never know what can happen. And now I saw many people, you know. During this 4 years of organizing this race, I saw so many, even, you know, overweighted people trying to make an ultra run. I said, what do you want to do? You know, you can show what, that you are, you know, weighing like 20 kilos more than limit, and you want to 24-hour run. Of course, yeah. After 6 or 7 hours, you just, you know, resigned because it was impossible. From the beginning, it was sure that they will not finish. Yeah, so I mean that the people shouldn't, you know, okay, Mount Everest is the highest mountain, you know, and everybody wants to go to climb it, yeah. But well, if you want to run an ultra marathon, something serious, just get tested before, you know. And I suppose if people would start like this, they would not be injured, but finish with happiness and smile at the face, and not like being, you know, dying.
Here's what's going to happen though, because getting that type of test is actually, I mean, it's not easy, but it's not hard in the US to get an exercise EKG. You know, the accessibility is there if you really want to go do it. But most of the times what happens is you end up going into your run-of-the-mill cardiologist that is well intended, but they're not working with an athletic population. And so they don't have the experience to interpret the results amongst an athlete. And an athlete's heart is, you know, as you guys are well aware of, is in many cases markedly different than a sedentary heart or somebody who is unfit or even diseased heart. But mark my word, this is what's going to happen. We're going to come back on a year from now and then revisit this discussion. All of the wearables, your Garmin's and your Suuntos and your Coros watches and things like that, the hardware is going to get good enough to where you can get exercise EKG on the wrist top. They're getting there now, but it's going to be more prevalent probably within about the next 12 to 24 months. When that data starts to come out, people are going to freak out. Like, people are just like, they're going to freak out. Am I going to kill myself on my next run? Because it doesn't exist right now. And when it starts to exist en masse, it's going to cause a lot of panic, because there already is this undercurrent in the endurance community that, yes, you can exercise too much, either too hard, too much volume, or whatever, and that's deleterious to cardiac function. Once the armchair cardiologists start to come out and start analyzing all of these EKG results en masse because of the wearables, trust me, it is going to cause so much panic. We're going to have to leave that banter for another day though. But I'm kind of with you that, especially for athletes that are experienced, just going in and getting routine exercise EKG with a cardiologist is a really good baseline to cross, just to make sure that, you know, your heart's in good shape.
Good shape, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, just to check it. I think that's a really good course of practice for anybody who wants to stay in the running game for an appreciable amount of time.
Brilliant.
All right, you guys, we're gonna let you go. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for your research, Alicia. I know this is a really big task to undertake. You're probably fortunate to have it in the rearview mirror now, knowing that you looked at this a year ago, but I appreciate you bringing it back up. Do either one of you, before we let you both go, want to let the audience know where they can find more about you, the lab, or the research that you're doing?
Okay, I think the easiest way to reach me is go to the ResearchGate, where all my data, all my papers are fully accessible in PDF files. So I invite you seriously, and then maybe at the end, just that short joke. At some point, I wanted to to improve my personal record in marathon. Well, it was lousy because it was in Athens. I did like 4 hours 15 minutes. That was great for me. And then I come to my friend, this chest pain marathoner, and I said, you have to help me to write me some training plan or whatever, just to be like 3:30. Okay, they're just looking at me, say, Zibi, the history of the marathon result, even just touch yourself, is there sense for this or not? And I was thinking about it. Okay, and from this point, I running like 4:30, 4:45. Happy, drinking water at water stations, like standing and talking with nice girls. And guys, that is also the reason maybe sometimes we push our bodies, our bodies, to useless maximum, which is nonsense sometimes, So maybe let's stop and run, look around, just speak with somebody running, and then we just prevent our injuries, that, running just to getting the better results.
So take the simple things is what you're trying to say. All right. I appreciate you guys coming on. We're going to let you go, and we'll bring you back on in a year once we start to look at all these EKG results. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. There you have it. There you go, folks. Much thanks to Alicia and Zibi for coming on the podcast today. I'm going to bring them back at another point in time. I'll also put links in the show notes to some of Zibi's research that he has done with this whole motivation aspect that we talked about. And I do think that goes hand in hand with a lot of what we see from an injury perspective. And as I mentioned during the podcast, I think a lot of this can come down to this overabundance of enthusiasm that we see in the trail and ultra running community, which is a really awesome part of the community, but also can be detrimental to the athletes themselves, and particularly when we're talking about injury rates within ultramarathon runners. As always, you guys, I appreciate the heck out of each and every one of you. If you like this podcast, you can share it with your friends, or you can give it a rating on iTunes. Both of those help the podcast out a tremendous amount. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.